Chapter 3. No Separate Existence. Page 42. Human beings depend on Earth and its life forms for every aspect of their survival and life. It is impossible to draw lines that delineate separate categories of air, water, soil, and life. You and I don't end at our fingertips or skin. We are connected through air, water, and soil. We are animated by the same energy from the same source in the sky above. We are quite literally air, water, soil, energy, and other living creatures. David Suzuki. In Western worldviews, we see ourselves as sharply defined individuals, each totally separate from everyone and everything else. This view is especially pronounced in the United States, with its ideals of rugged individualism and people pulling themselves up by their own bootstraps. We similarly view the rest of our world as a collection of sharply distinct and separate things, and ourselves as a collection of separate parts. We have sliced and diced our world and ourselves to the point of blindness to interconnections. Misguided beliefs. A misperception that humans are separate from and superior to nature and other species fuels our disastrous lifestyle as we futilely try to impose our will on the world around us. We extend this approach to others within our species. Our history of technological innovation, especially agriculture, led to increased division of labor, complex hierarchical societies with large population centers, and magnified feelings of superiority of the privileged few over commoners. Despite America's values of equality and freedom, revered around the world, and despite our heroic mythology, America was built on atrocities justified by assumptions of superiority. White people came to this country. Page 43. Slaughtered its rightful owners, and forced Native Americans and Africans into slavery. 117. Women were property with no rights or property of their own. It was mostly slaves who built the White House and the U.S. Capitol. 118. Our current paradigm reduces citizens to consumers and human resources and puts them last in importance. Filmmaker Michael Moore, in his documentary Sicko, says the current regime has people where it wants them, feeling hopeless, pessimistic, frightened, and demoralized. 119. Citizens take orders and hope for the best, putting up with the top 1% of the world's population who enjoy 80% of the wealth. As former British Member of Parliament Tony Benn observed, an educated, confident, and healthy nation is harder to govern. 120. An educated, confident, and healthy nation is harder to govern. Tony Benn. Slavery is the ultimate example, besides killing, of separation and keeping people powerless. Many people are not aware that human trafficking flourishes today. Though slavery is banned in most countries, the world currently has about 45 million slaves in at least 167 countries, more than at any time in human history. 121. Not all human cultures engage in arrogance. New Zealand's Kiwis believe it is the responsibility of humans to protect the natural world and that the knowledge of the ancients may hold a key to the planet's survival. 122. A little humility would lead Westerners to sign scientist David Suzuki's Declaration of Interdependence, which affirms our intent to preserve the Earth, based on the understanding we are completely dependent on and interconnected with nature. 123. Indigenous people, sometimes known as tribal people, first people, or native people, have historical continuity with pre-colonial societies and constitute about 5% of the world's human population. As indigenous societies worldwide continue to be wrecked by the juggernaut of civilized resource plundering, humanity is losing its ancient knowledge of plants, animals, nature, and human adaptation. Logging and mining destroy the rainforests of indigenous people who have lived in them for thousands of years. 124. Westerners believe that survival of the fittest means duking it out between or among species, with the victor surviving and the loser dying. Yet this ignores countless real-life examples in which cooperation makes species fittest, as in the case of fungi and algae living in symbiotic partnership in the form of lichen. Our hierarchical, separation-based worldview promotes a way of life based on competition rather than harmony. We think in terms of the Page 44. Economy versus the environment, us versus them, humans versus nature, and the mind versus the body. What an exhausting way to live. Thousands of indigenous people led by the Confederation of Indigenous Nationalities of Ecuador converged on the town of Quito, culminating a 15-day march demanding a new water law, land reform, and an end to open-pit mining and new oil concessions. Photo credit, copyright Amazon Watch. People on the forefront of science lament society's resistance to new information. We see this happening today with climate science denial and even denial of evolution more than 150 years after publication of Charles Darwin's The Origin of Species. Of respondents to a recent poll of Americans, 45% agreed with this statement. God created human beings pretty much in their present form at one time within the past 10,000 years or so. 125. Similarly, we often believe we're powerless to solve the global problems we face, even though history proves otherwise. Consider the Montreal Protocol on substances that deplete the ozone layer, an international agreement adopted in 1987 that has contributed to a significant drop in total global production and consumption of ozone-depleting substances. 126. Author and researcher Lynn McTaggart writes that new ideas are always considered heretical and that to be a revolutionary in science today is to flirt with professional suicide. Much as the field purports to encourage experimental freedom, the entire structure of science, with its highly competitive grant system, coupled with the publishing and peer review system, largely depends upon individuals conforming to the accepted scientific worldview. 127. Page 45. We learn conformity at an early age. Many U.S. schools teach to the test, with students memorizing content asked for on standardized tests rather than learning how to question, learn, focus, listen, research, critically evaluate, and problem solve. Author Napoleon Hill wrote that the public school system teaches children almost everything except how to use their own minds and think independently. 128. Knowledge is power and, according to a quote attributed to Thomas Jefferson, information is the currency of democracy. Democracy can't survive without free thought and a free press. The Federal Communications Commission fails to preserve competition in the citizen-owned airwaves, approving ever more media consolidation. Large absentee corporations feel freer to eliminate reporters, gut newsrooms, and replace substantive news and debate with celebrity gossip and pap. 129 Bill Moyers quotes his mentor, Paul Thompson at the University of Texas, who said, "News is what people want to keep hidden. Everything else is publicity. We suffer from too much publicity and too little news about some of the dire issues impacting our lives." Network news typically ignores logging and mining travesties, decimation of indigenous societies, murders of environmental activists, wetlands violations, adverse health effects of synthetic chemicals, factory farming, and other health and environmental news. Network news reports those rare times when a shark bites a human, but it seldom mentions the wasteful slaughter of millions of sharks by the fishing industry that is driving some species toward extinction. 130. Climate change receives some coverage, but not with the depth the situation calls for. Luckily, alternative media provide more comprehensive reporting. The individual human. We are designed not to go it alone but to live in full integration with other species and other humans. Humans and pre-humans survived by cooperating and living in groups, not by living as isolated individuals. And the individual human survives only by cooperating with other species. The healthy human body contains 50 trillion to 100 trillion human cells living harmoniously. 131. Microbial cells outnumber human cells 10 to 1. More than 10,000 microbial species, mostly bacteria, occupy the human ecosystem, and microbes contribute more genes responsible for human survival than humans contribute. 132 genes turn biological functions on and off. Beneficial microorganisms produce certain vitamins, bolster our immune response, keep harmful microorganisms in check, and more. David Perlmutter, MD, writes that our relatively low number of human cells and genes indicates that we have offloaded the storage of much of our page 46. DNA information to the cloud or an external hard drive that resides in gut bacteria. This microbiome, which is the genetic information contained within our gut bacteria, plays a huge role in our health outcomes. We live in a mutually beneficial relationship with these organisms whose mission is to keep us healthy, because we provide their home. 133. Our food and lifestyle choices dictate the health and diversity of our gut microorganisms. Adverse changes in gut microorganisms have been associated with conditions such as autism, Alzheimer's disease, and inflammatory bowel disease. 134. Overuse of antibiotics may be fueling dramatic increases in many illnesses by destroying the body's beneficial bacteria. 135. In addition, high sugar, high carbohydrate, and low fiber diets, stress, steroids, birth control pills, and other pharmaceuticals may be promoting harmful yeast and fungi at the expense of beneficial bacteria. 136. Tom O'Brien, D.C., says gut dysfunction is the #1 culprit in our culture today for many of the diseases we are battling. 137. Though our body feels relatively constant and immutable, the average age of all the cells in an adult human's body may be as little as 7 to 10 years. Cells in our gut lining last only 5 days. 138. We are constantly cycling materials into and out of our bodies, including our bones. When one considers all the other species living in us and on us, as well as all the things that go into and out of our body, we seem more like a habitat for small beings or a distribution center than a self-contained separate existence. In our delusional feeling of separateness and autonomy, we also don't notice how strongly we are shaped by external forces, our environment, family, friends, teachers, employers, religion, advertising, language, and the arts. Our feeling of separation is not universal. In the unified worldview of the Lakota Sioux people, each person is regarded as an intimate part of the natural world, not separate from it. The community is the basic unit of study, not the individual. The idea is that we are formed by relationships, we are not individual, autonomous units. 139. In the Western world, we identify more with our brain and mind as ourselves and view our body more like a machine subject to the laws of physics and chemistry. Similarly, we cut off our heart from our mind. Primatologist and conservationist Jane Goodall says science that explicitly excludes the heart is very cold. Goodall says that a disconnect between the human brain and the human heart can lead to serious problems. I truly believe that only when head and heart live in harmony can we reach our true human potential. And our potential is huge. 140. Conventional medicine, in which most doctors specialize in one body part, system, or disease, further divides the person into a collection of disconnected parts. This may be okay for the treatment of a broken leg or. Page 47. Another acute problem, however, this silo approach fails to fix many chronic illnesses. Andrew Weil, MD, writes, our health or lack of it is the result of biochemical interactions and genetics, dietary choices, exercise patterns, sleep habits, hopes, fears, families, friends, jobs, hobbies, cultures, ecosystems, and more. In addition, illnesses such as heart disease and depression are multifactorial health problems rooted in complex interactions of biological, psychological, and social variables. 141. I truly believe that only when head and heart live in harmony can we reach our true human potential. And our potential is huge. Jane Goodall. Within ourselves, the dueling higher self and the ego-centered inner critic self can destroy our peace. Furthermore, and contrary to the ideal of rugged individualism, we frequently excise and disown parts of ourselves, putting them outside of ourselves into other people. That is, instead of ultimately relying on inner guidance to direct our life choices, when we seek guidance from someone who we believe knows better, a therapist, friend, counselor, or expert, we may place greater weight on what that person says than on what our higher self says. We fragment and compartmentalize our behaviors. A businessperson who loves his or her family and exemplifies the model citizen in the community may, at work, abuse people or the environment, rationalizing, "That's business." My grandfather remarked that when he grew up in the South, devout white people would go to church on Sunday and to a lynching on Monday. Balancing the competing demands of our inner and outer worlds is not easy. Some tree-burning opponents I worked with focused on the need to block the biomass plants at the expense of their own health and well-being, not eating well, getting enough sleep, or sufficiently recharging their batteries. At the other extreme, I observe people working hard to perfect their lifestyles and care for their immediate families and friends, while remaining relatively oblivious to the wider world and doing little to help it. Striking a good balance. My grandfather, Paul Green, fought tenaciously for civil rights, back when it was virtually unheard of for a white person in the South to speak out for racial equality. Often, my grandfather would be the only one protesting an injustice or tirelessly traveling the state in search of a lawyer willing to represent a black defendant. A writer and teacher by profession, he kept himself strong and positive with a balance of daily physical labor, chiefly farming, eating well, engaging with his family and community, and enjoying humor and the arts. He lived a healthy life to the age of 80. Page 48. 7 and accomplished so much, including the publication of a shelf full of books and plays, numerous movie scripts, and outdoor symphonic dramas, some of which are still performed regularly throughout the United States. Insecurity plaguing many Americans and others today discourages risk-taking. With job security gone, wages flat, union power diminished, and nest eggs wrecked by Wall Street tycoons, workers often overworked, isolated, and vulnerable turn inward. We idle in ever-worsening traffic jams, and squeeze out time for sleep, cooking, exercising, studying, discussing citizenly duties, and pursuing our dreams and priorities. We're demoralized by all the bad news we hear from the media. With insecurity also comes the notion of scarcity. People compete more while cooperating less, asking what can I get, rather than what can I give, and what do I really want. It's no wonder that many of us, preoccupied by fear, distraction, and ill health, just try to get by. Meanwhile, the top 1% help themselves to resources while no one is looking. The human species. Though developed societies slice and dice the human species based on gender, age, ethnicity, and so on, there is no biological basis for such differentiation. The Human Genome Project shows that all human beings are 99.9% identical in their genetic makeup. 142 Yet fragmentation and separation extends even to the family level, and now as never before in human history. Families formerly stayed together in close geographical proximity. Now, family members increasingly live far apart geographically. Couples commonly go through divorce and separation, though, previously, many people were forced to stay together in unhappy marriages, a poor alternative. Even when families do live together, individuals increasingly fend for themselves, perhaps eating different meals at different times or watching televisions, or other devices, in their own rooms. With the Industrial Revolution, the number of generations typically living together in close contact and cooperation shrank from 3 to 2, with grandparents living elsewhere. 143. Once valued for their wisdom and active role in family life, elders are now sometimes seen as over the hill, extraneous, and burdensome. The baby boom that followed World War II combined with an increase in average life expectancy has created growing numbers of retirees. In 2011, baby boomers began reaching age 65 at the rate of 10,000 people every day in the United States alone. 144. Many elders feel cut off from the rest of Western society, which considers them to be finished contributing and tends. Page 49. To exclude and think negatively of them. 145. Likewise, many young people increasingly live in narrow communities, more often sharing time with their peers than with their nuclear family and only occasionally with grandparents. And young people more frequently communicate remotely over phones and the internet. 146. Separation allows individuals to feel freer to do their own thing. But in many ways, separation can make people feel less powerful. Solitary confinement represents the extreme condition of separation and powerlessness, and some consider it to be unconstitutional, cruel, and unusual punishment. 147. Just as an individual is most powerful when all of his or her components are working together harmoniously rather than warring against each other unproductively, people's power increases when they band together and cooperate in groups. Labor unions can usually negotiate higher wages and better working conditions than individuals can. Divide and conquer is an ageless strategy for gaining control over others. United we stand, divided we fall. Advertisers use the divide and conquer approach to make individuals feel separate and inadequate, a situation easily remedied by buying the advertiser's products. We live in a touch-deprived society, says Dr. Weil, observing that animal and human infants deprived of physical contact don't develop normally and can actually die. 148. Today, the connection Westerners yearn for arrives via phones and computers. Clinical psychologist Sherry Tickle says children can't resist texting in class, and we are so vulnerable to the seduction of who wants to reach us, what sweetness is coming through the phone, that we're really at a point where we turn away from our kids. Westerners' attention is divided between the world of the people we're with and this other reality. 149. Separation exacts a high price. The World Health Organization reports that rates of depression are rising and predicts that by 2030, more individuals will be affected by depression than by any other health condition, representing the biggest worldwide health burden on society both economically and sociologically. 150. Dr. Weil cites modern industrial food, information overload, noise, sleep deprivation, and aggressive marketing of pharmaceuticals as factors contributing to stress. But high on his list are social isolation and nature deficit disorder that separate individuals from other people and from the natural world. He writes that an astonishing 1 in 10 people, in the United States, of whom millions are children, takes one or more antidepressant drugs. 151. By 2030, why more individuals will be affected by depression than by any other health condition. World Health Organization. Page 50. Suppressing the feminine. It would take too long to cover all the varieties of discrimination among humans, though they are all critically important. Gender discrimination, which affects the most people, illustrates the general idea. More broadly, suppressing the feminine affects many aspects of our society as a whole, fostering competition and discouraging cooperation, self-control, and nurturing. Whether from nature or nurture, Daniel Amen, MD, after examining 120,000 brain scans of people from 111 countries, concludes that female brains are dramatically more active than male brains throughout about 80% of the brain. He concludes that women's strengths include empathy, intuition, collaboration, self-control, and appropriate worry. On the flip side, women are more vulnerable to anxiety, depression, eating disorders, insomnia, and pain. He says it is women who will change the world, and when women do better for themselves, children and men also benefit because women tend to care for them. 152. Former U.S. vice presidential candidate Barbara Marx Hubbard recalls when, soon after their wedding, her husband asked what kind of stove she wanted. She said she didn't want any stove, she wanted to go to Washington and get a job. 153. But instead, she capitulated, carrying out the prescribed role of wife and mother. Only much later did she enter public life, inspiring people with her writing and speaking. Deepak Chopra, MD, calls Hubbard the voice for conscious evolution. The world could have used her genius a lot sooner, during those early years when she worked in the home. Women's physically smaller size renders them inherently vulnerable to coercion by men. Nevertheless, cultures vary widely in how they define gender roles. Some Native American and other tribes practice gender equality. Anthropologist Margaret Mead studied cultures in New Guinea, including the Chambili, in which women were more dominant and men were more submissive. She concluded that human nature is almost unbelievably malleable. 154. Exceptions notwithstanding, males dominate females throughout most of the world today. 155. In 1995, then First Lady Hillary Clinton explained, women comprise more than half the world's population, 70% of the world's poor, and 2/3 of those who are not taught to read and write. Much of the work we do is not valued, not by economists, not by historians, not by popular culture, not by government leaders. Women also are dying from diseases that should have been prevented or treated. They are being denied the right to go to school, by their own fathers and brothers. They are being barred from the bank lending offices and banned from the ballot box. Tragically, women are most often the ones whose human rights are violated. Page 51. These abuses have continued because, for too long, the history of women has been a history of silence. As long as discrimination and inequities remain so commonplace everywhere in the world, as long as girls and women are valued less, fed last, overworked, underpaid, not schooled, subjected to violence in and outside their homes, the potential of the human family to create a peaceful, prosperous world will not be realized. 156. This horrific situation still holds today. Worldwide, 1 woman in 3 will be beaten or raped during her lifetime. 157. In the United States, nearly 1 woman in 3 has experienced domestic violence and almost 1 in 5 has been raped. 158. As long as girls and women are valued less, fed last, overworked, underpaid, not schooled, subjected to violence in and outside their homes, the potential of the human family to create a peaceful, prosperous world will not be realized. Hillary Clinton. The World Bank finds substantial evidence of discrimination by banks against women entrepreneurs. 159. Women also face discrimination in mortgage lending, hindering women's ability to build wealth and financial security. 160. Women are subjected to a myriad of subtler forms of discrimination. In 2011, the department store JCPenney marketed t-shirts to girls between the ages of 7 and 16 that said, "I'm too pretty to do homework, so my brother has to do it for me." 161. Women are the other, the outsider, the woman doctor. We may have come a long way, baby, but we still have a long way to go. Author and feminist organizer Gloria Steinem, writing that we're not even halfway there, recently looked at unfinished goals of the feminist movement. These include equal valuing of women's work, ending violence against women, reproductive freedom, and equality in parenthood and housework. To achieve these goals requires not only pushing ahead but also, due to a powerful backlash to the victories won, actively holding ground women have already won. 162. Gender bias in my lifetime. I was born into the first generation in human history in which many women have reproductive choice. However, vestiges of the expectation that normal women have children have lingered. When my grandmothers were born, women did not even have the right to vote. Both of my grandmothers went to college, which was unusual, but after getting married, both devoted their lives to their families without pursuing careers of their own. Their daughters became highly successful in their chosen careers and did not relinquish their careers to take care of their families. They retained a residue of deference to male power, however. Page 52. I remember my mother explaining to me when I was little that the father is the king of the castle with the ultimate say over how things will be. I didn't buy it then, or since. I'm not sure she really bought it either. Luckily, gender equality was much more highly valued in my family than in many others. All the boys and girls in my family did housework and yard work chores equally. Growing up, I was fairly sharp but often dumbed myself down in social situations to be more acceptable to males. While studying engineering in the early 1980s, I felt intimidated in the environment where men vastly outnumbered women. I worked extra hard to do well. Even on my hour-long daily walk, I'd bring a stack of index cards with notes and study them as I walked. The glass ceiling remains. In my professional career, I still observe that men are accepted and presumed competent unless they prove themselves to be incompetent, while women are often viewed skeptically and presumed incompetent until they prove themselves to be competent. Women must prove themselves to each new person, which exacts an exhausting tax on their psyches. I still sometimes hear men call women girls. Women are passed over for promotion, held to higher standards, and paid less. I co-presented a workshop at the Danish Technical University along with my client and my colleague, both males without PhDs. A poster at the conference listed us as presenters, with a PhD after each of their names but not after mine. Refusing to let that stand, I spoke with the conference organizer, who promptly corrected the error. My colleague said the conference organizers listed us that way of their own volition, likely as a courtesy. I feel an obligation to push for gender equality because I can, while so many cannot. Many women are denied the human right of controlling their own bodies. Dr. Kenneth Edelin, an American crusader for legal and safe abortion and for the rights of the poor and African Americans, wrote, "For me, the struggles for reproductive rights for women and civil rights for African Americans are intertwined and at the same time parallel. The denial of these two rights is an attempt by some to control the bodies of others. Both are forms of slavery." 163. 40 years after the landmark Roe v. Wade decision legalizing a woman's right to abortion, Bill Moyers said that the forces opposed to abortion seem more determined than ever. More than half of all U.S. women of reproductive age now live in a state that is hostile to abortion rights, an increase from a decade ago. Lynn Paltrow, executive director of the National Advocates for Pregnant Women, told Moyers that women are beginning to recognize that what's at stake is more than abortion. It is their personhood, their ability to be full, equal, constitutional persons in the United States of America. 164. The fighting for the rights of the children ploy is unveiled when the same people who so vociferously promote the rights of the unborn also vote to. Page 53. Funding for the Federal Women, Infants, and Children Nutritional Assistance Program. 165. As bad as the gender arrangement is for women, men suffer from it too. Traditional roles that require men to be strong and independent, while they bring home the bacon and protect their families, can cause isolation and pressure. Gun violence and genocide are carried out overwhelmingly by men, and the suicide rate for males is 4 times the rate for females. 166. War, lethal fighting between groups, is like an autoimmune disease of the human species. Humans attack other humans in war the way cells attack other cells in autoimmune disease, mistakenly identifying them as enemies. War is common but not inevitable among social animal species. Bonobos, our close relatives formerly known as pygmy chimpanzees, have not been observed making war. Similarly, though all human societies practice both violence and cooperation, a few indigenous societies do not engage in war. Peaceful human societies are typically isolated or living on marginal lands at low population densities. Victors of war benefit by capturing humans for labor, by taking possession of domesticated animals, food, land, or other valuable resources, by enhancing their prestige and reputation as people not to be messed with, or by keeping other people away. 167. Nuclear stockpiles around the world represent a constant threat to everyone. 168. Ironically, nuclear weapons are so powerful that they drive us to peace. No one can afford to use them, though in a moment of weakness, someone may. Unfortunately, people can afford to, and do, use conventional weapons, though at enormous cost. Governments have killed about 260 million people in the last 100 years. 169 The United States alone has killed more than 20 million people in 37 nations since World War II. 170 The Iraq and Afghanistan conflicts together will be the most expensive wars in U.S. history, with a total cost between $4 trillion to $6 trillion, most of which is yet to be paid. 171. Imagine what else we could do with that much money. War is a key mode of operation and an integral part of culture in much of the world today. We practice chemical warfare on our agricultural fields. Many Americans enjoy war and violence in their free time in the form of violent movies and video games and confrontational sports. History books and media glamorize war. It seems we just can't get enough of war and violence. Corporations versus citizens. The division of labor among us who live in developed societies makes us highly dependent on one another. A typical American relies on others for. Page 54. Food, housing, energy, employment, and entertainment, whereas in the recent past, individual families took care of much of this on their own. We now put the interests of corporations above the interests of citizens, supported by a framework of laws giving corporations wide latitude to harm humans and the environment. Citizens are exhorted to not ask for too much lest we harm the economy, as if the economy is some kind of god. Safety testing of chemicals may hurt the economy, or protecting that forest from clear-cutting could cost jobs. Our system rewards short-term greed at the expense of the commons, the natural and cultural resources we hold in common rather than privately, such as air, water, soil, habitable climate, and public infrastructure and buildings. Powerful individuals, via corporate entities, use their short-term gains to amass ever greater wealth and power, which they use to turn government into an enabler of corporate power. Corporations can then grab more resources and leave more damage behind. 172. Nature. As Westerners have increasingly exploited and subjugated nature, our misguided notion of separation from nature has become ingrained in our language. We speak of humans and animals as if they were mutually exclusive, forgetting that humans are animals. Our ignorance and disrespectful attitude are revealed when we use words such as "she treated him like an animal." 90% of our human genetic code is shared with chimpanzees. Analogous percentages for some other species are mouse, 88, cow, 85, dog, 84, zebrafish, 73, chicken, 65, fruit fly, 47, honeybee, 44, roundworm, 38, rice, 25, wine grape, 24, and baker's yeast, 18%. 173 Naturalist S.Y. Montgomery, citing a dangerous disconnect between us and the rest of animate creation, explains that animals share a lot of the same emotions we have, because neurotransmitters in different species are similar. A clam that's being opened and thus panicking will show the same neurotransmitters in its bloodstream as a person having a heart attack. 174 Many people in the Western world are so disconnected from nature they don't know where their food and water come from, where their waste goes, basic facts about the natural world, or even the names of common plant and animal species in their environs. Americans on average spend 90% of their lives indoors. In the United States, children's contact with nature and the outdoors has declined precipitously. While 96% of adults report the outdoors was their most important environment during childhood, in an average week, a typical child today spends less than 1 hour outdoors. Page 55. Compared with 52 hours engaged with electronic media, television, computers, and video games. 175. Today, in an average week, a typical child spends less than 1 hour outdoors compared with 52 hours engaged with electronic media. Nature deficit afflicted children may not become strong protectors of the environment. People who love plants, animals, water, air, and soil do not harm them without a thought or care, just as people who love other people do not harm them without a thought or care. But many of us don't get to know or learn to care about plants, animals, and the natural world. Like every other organism on Earth, we evolved in intimate connection with nature, and our new feeling of disconnection runs counter to our biology and psyche developed over eons. A friend of mine drove past an area near her home and saw the trees had been cut down. She started crying when she told me about it and was startled by her tears. She told me she had no idea she felt so strongly about the forest. Many people in the developed world still feel a visceral connection with nature, whether consciously or not. The world's protected natural areas receive 8 billion visits a year. 176. The National Park Service reported more than 273 million recreation visitors to U.S. national parks in 2013. 177 Birdwatching and gardening are among the fastest growing outdoor hobbies in the United States. 178 More than 65 million Americans care for birds, spending many billions of dollars each year on bird food, feeders, baths, houses, and other accessories. 179. At the same time, ecocrime, which includes wildlife poaching and smuggling, toxic waste dumping, and illegal fishing, logging, and mining, is the fourth largest criminal enterprise in the world and growing fast. A lot of people have cut ties with nature. 180. Our deadly combination of arrogance and ignorance threatens our life support system and thus our very existence. Philosopher Kathleen Dean Moore says, "We have brought the world to the brink of ruin by acting under the delusion that humans are separate from the earth, better somehow, in control of it. We believe that humans are the only creatures of spirit in the universe otherwise made up of stones and insensate matter, that the non-human world was created for us alone and derives all its value from its usefulness to humanity, that we are the masters of the universe. Because of our technological prowess, we see ourselves as exceptions to the rules that govern the lower forms of life. We believe we can destroy our habitat without also destroying ourselves. How could we be so tragically wrong?" Page 56. Connections. Science, including quantum theory, increasingly shows just how interconnected everything in our world is. The individualistic story Westerners have been living, based on the work of physicist Isaac Newton, is more than 300 years old. This story defines the world as a collection of separate and well-behaved things following fixed laws of time and space. Naturalist Charles Darwin augmented this view with the notion that individual living things compete against each other to survive in a world without enough to go around. In her books The Field and the Bond, author and researcher Lynn McTaggart explains that new science shows there are no individual things, that all things are bonded, and that nature has a tendency to connect rather than to compete. She says, subatomic particles aren't little billiard balls vibrating independently. Rather, they are nothing more than little knots of energy that briefly emerge and disappear back into the underlying field. According to quantum field theory, the individual entity is transient and insubstantial. The new science reveals that what's important isn't the thing but the relationship. She writes in the field, what we believe to be our stable, static universe is in fact a seething maelstrom of subatomic particles fleetingly popping in and out of existence. 181. Further, quantum physics has demonstrated there is no such thing as a vacuum. The field, also called the zero-point field, is the web of energy exchange in so-called empty space that connects everything in the universe. Frontier science indicates it's impossible to determine where one thing ends and another begins, our body and the environment, for example. McTaggart explains that we now know genes are like the keys of a piano. They sit there silently until they are expressed. And what expresses them is a quartet of atoms called an epigene that sits above the gene, which is affected by environmental influences such as food, water, and friends. Thus we are not self-contained isolated entities. Furthermore, McTaggart maintains that the science from many fields overwhelmingly indicates we were made to cooperate rather than compete. 182. In the words of Albert Einstein, a human being experiences himself, his thoughts and feelings as something separated from the rest, a kind of optical delusion of his consciousness. This delusion is a kind of prison for us, restricting us to our personal desires and to affection for a few persons nearest to us. Our task must be to free ourselves from this prison by widening our circle of compassion to embrace all living creatures and the whole of nature in its beauty. 183. Page 57. The field may explain some things that prior science could not. McTaggart writes, some scientists went so far as to suggest that all of our high cognitive processes result from an interaction with the zero-point field. This kind of constant interaction might account for intuition or creativity and how ideas come to us in bursts of insight, sometimes in fragments but often as a miraculous whole. An intuitive leap might simply be a sudden coalescence of coherence in the field. It makes sense something is going on when, shortly after we think of a person for the first time in years, that person calls on the telephone out of the blue. The field also could account for prophetic dreams, distant healing, and other phenomena conventional science can't explain. Like everything else, our institutions and policies are extensively interconnected, feeding off and supporting each other in a complex ecosystem of their own. Consider this. The petroleum industry provides oil as raw material for the chemical industry. The chemical industry makes synthetic chemicals for big agriculture and big food, whose products cause chronic disease, thus creating markets for the pharmaceutical and healthcare industries. After all, 70% of cancers are related to diet, and cancer is big business. 184. Keeping our petroleum supply chain going sometimes involves war, for example, in the Middle East, which creates business for the defense industry, itself a big user of oil and thus a large client of the petroleum industry. 185 and so on. Industries give cash, often secretly, to politicians, who reward industries with subsidies and other special favors, conferring on them competitive advantages. Subsidies essentially take money from you and me in the form of taxes and gift the money to selected corporations or other institutions, sometimes ultimately as quid pro quo for campaign contributions. This extra money allows the industries to offer their goods and services to us at a lower sticker price. Competing industries not receiving subsidies must reflect all their costs in their sticker prices, resulting in prices higher than those of their subsidized counterparts. Consumers compare sticker prices and choose the subsidized alternative, thinking it's cheaper. This may be an illusion, of course, because we are usually unwittingly also paying above and beyond the sticker price through our taxes. Subsidies steer consumers into making choices that oftentimes are not in consumers' best interests. We pay attention to small changes in prices posted at the gas pump, oblivious to the humongous sums siphoned out of our pockets via taxes and delivered to the oil companies as subsidies on a regular basis. Perverse subsidies leave out the interests of citizens and their environment, essentially going behind our backs with under-the-table spending of our money. Page 58. Perverse subsidies leave out the interests of citizens and their environment, essentially going behind our backs with under-the-table spending of our money. Citizens often lose, suffering illness and death from unhealthy food and pharmaceuticals, getting wounded and killed in wars, paying for subsidies, living in a degraded environment, and foregoing advocacy by their political representatives who collude with corporate entities. This corrupt system enriches those at the top, ever widening the gap between the few haves and the multitude of have-nots. Citizens experience even more financial stress and have to work harder to put food on the table. Weak, unhealthy, worried, overworked, and frazzled citizens feel they have no time to be involved citizens, who could potentially change the parasitic industrial ecosystem. So the system perpetuates, in a downward spiral that promotes unevolved politicians and CEOs at the expense of citizens. Reconnecting. At the same time that Westerners feel increasingly separated, connectivity is increasing as science reveals more about reality and as humanity behaves more globally. Bruce Lipton and Steve Behrman write, "We are each and all cells in the body of an evolving giant superorganism we call humanity." 186. Thanks to the internet, we now have a global brain we can tap into almost instantaneously, with abilities to both upload and download information. Telephones enable us to talk with people almost anywhere on the planet. The economy is now global, as are some environmental impacts, such as climate change. On September 21, 2014, hundreds of thousands of people in 150 countries participated in a People's Climate March, pressing for action to address climate change. The march was reported via the internet from all over the world. 187 When terrorists flew airplanes into the World Trade Center and other U.S. locations on September 11, 2001, the world stood still and there was a worldwide outpouring of grief and support for the United States. 188. As conventional medicine fails to address chronic illnesses, holistic medicine puts the pieces of the human back together again and also considers the person's environment. One form of holistic medicine, integrative medicine, takes account of the whole person, body, mind, and spirit, and makes use of all appropriate therapies, both conventional and alternative. Functional medicine is similar, but it provides an architecture to help organize and apply medical knowledge in a systematic way to dig deeper into the Page 59. Origins of disease and the determinants of health. 189 These approaches strive to keep a person healthy and, barring that, to successfully treat the whole person, with his or her interrelated symptoms and systems. Dr. Hyman writes that mainstream medicine is missing synthesis and integration. There are millions of bits of data and information, and yet for most practitioners of medicine they are strewn about the floor like a million puzzle pieces. 190 Dr. Weil writes, professionals are even more fed up than patients with the dead end that the drug-only approach represents. 191 Similarly, organic agriculture puts the ecological pieces back together and grows food in sustainable ecosystems rather than in industrial monocultures, single crops. The beautiful yet sobering images of Earth from space made the concept of one unified Earth and one unified human species living on a finite Earth concrete and irrefutable. Photo credit, NASA, http://www.nasa.gov/multimedia/image-feature_329.html. Creating a sustainable world involves realizing we are not solitary individuals acting alone. The stakes could not be higher in our interconnected world. Pessimism and gloom can spread, easily facilitated by global communications. But so can hope and goodwill. Humans, acting together, can create massive change. American colonists defeated England in the 1700s by joining together. Adolf Hitler was defeated. Page 60. In the 1940s, when countries of the world joined together in common purpose in World War II, American citizens banded together to stop the Vietnam War in the 1970s. Today, hundreds of non-governmental environmental organizations are driving change. 192. Learning from Indigenous Societies. It seems as if Western society is on the verge of leaving its adolescent phase and entering adulthood. This involves transitioning from awkwardness, impulsiveness, rudimentary skills, and, perhaps, illusions of invincibility to a state in which we have greater awareness, skills, command of ourselves, sense of purpose and responsibility, and recognition of our mortality. Many Westerners now feel the urge to break out of our unsustainable and combative way of life. As spiritual teacher Eckhart Tolle writes, humanity is under great pressure to evolve because it is our only chance of survival as a race. 193. We can learn from other societies. Humans have come up with a range of solutions to universal problems in learning how to live almost anywhere on Earth. Civilizations and writing arose only 5,400 years ago. Therefore, people living in civilizations are a tiny and unrepresentative slice of humanity. Indigenous societies, which are far more representative of the totality of humanity, can teach us about what is typical for humans and also what is possible. There are 370 million indigenous people, a population larger than that of the United States, living in 90 countries in all regions of the world. 194. Many indigenous societies have lived in harmony with their environments for thousands of years. Indigenous people spend much more of their time outdoors than Westerners, and they often feel deeply and spiritually rooted to the land, in contrast to Westerners' sense of disconnection with nature. Similarly, social bonds in indigenous societies are stronger than in Western societies. Loneliness is relatively uncommon, in contrast to the 1 in 5 Americans who experience persistent loneliness. 195. Because their members typically do not travel far, indigenous groups of people end up living together for their entire lives and sharing with each other, even when they have very little. Evolution did not prepare us for the American way of living in relative isolation and frequently relocating to new homes. People who have moved from indigenous societies to Western ones report that they miss the lifelong social bonds of their former community. Habits of indigenous societies indicate the wide range of diets humans evolved to eat, including, in the Arctic region, diets comprised exclusively of meat. And they show humans did not evolve to eat the standard American. Page 61. Diet, which is high in animal fats, unhealthy fats, and processed foods, and low in fiber, complex carbohydrates, and plant-based foods. People living in indigenous societies typically do not die from chronic diseases that kill Westerners: stroke, diabetes, and heart attacks. But if they adopt the standard American diet, they begin contracting chronic diseases. 196.